start by acknowledging the unceded, occupied Indigenous land that we're gathered on here today. And I'm talking specifically, as Samaya said, about Jason Kenney, who's the current Minister of Immigration. His official title is Citizenship, Immigration, and Multiculturalism, but we also call him the Minister of Censorship and Deportation because of his particular record as one of the most repressive immigration ministers in Canadian history. I want to preface this by saying, of course, because we have, as Jaggi articulated, a no one is legal analysis. So although I'm talking about Jason Kenney specifically, he is one manifestation and one particular symbol in this current moment of all of the repressive immigration policies and changes and trends and exclusionary kind of legacies that we've been seeing for decades and centuries. And so although I'm focusing on him, by no way am I articulating that getting rid of Jason Kenney solves the problem, right? It's just to focus on what the current policies are and what the current kind of regime looks like. And the other thing that, I don't have time to articulate this, but I do want to emphasize, because I'm talking about immigration policy, that talking about Jason Kenney and immigration policy in this moment doesn't allow for me to speak about what no one is legal means in the much larger and broader context of decolonization and anti-colonial struggle, particularly for no one is illegal as migrants of color, racialized people, and what it means to struggle alongside Indigenous people on Turtle Island. And so, while I don't have time to articulate that, I hope people will grab some of the literature and learn more about some of the Indigenous sovereignty struggles that No One Is Legal is aligning ourselves with. And I think it's also interesting to note that the first immigration department in Canada was actually called the Department of Immigration and Colonization. And so we see how this process and ideology of colonization is very deliberately utilized, displaced and exploited migrant labor as part of the project of forcible land acquisition and theft resource of Indigenous communities. And we see that, most recently with the tar sands, with the active exploitation of migrant workers to exploit Indigenous lands and Indigenous resources. And so those kinds of alliances and those kinds of realities, very complex realities about the ways in which immigrants are used and commodified as part of this colonial project is something that we have to contend with, but unfortunately I'm not going to be able to talk much about that. So in terms of Jason Kenney, I want to talk about two main things, or two kind of pieces of it. One is to talk about, just describe to you some of the current changes and policies, just to update people who may be unfamiliar with what's going on in immigration world, if you will. And then to kind of talk more about analyzing what that means specifically in relationship to race, class, labor, and migration, and to understand what this means in terms of the project of fortifying Fortress North America. So firstly, just some stats. Deportations have drastically increased in the past 4 years, while the number of people who've been accepted as refugees and sponsored family members have drastically dropped. So according to figures obtained by the Canadian press, deportations from Canada have skyrocketed 50% over the last decade, with approximately 13,000 deportations annually. Since the Conservatives have been in power, the number of approved asylum claims has dropped by 56%. Simultaneously, a 2009 annual report reveals a decreasing quote-unquote target of 11,000 people who will be accepted refugees and sponsored family members. At a policy level, Kenney has most recently introduced Bill C-11, and we've seen how all the political parties have kind of sold out on this bill, and it's being kind of proclaimed as a success with all of the amendments. But I think we have to understand that this bill is being touted and spun as a kind of positive reform for refugees, and innocuous kind of words are used like balance and fairness for refugees, but in reality the bill creates 2 tiers of refugees, which is a racist system based on nationality. These changes also download financial and social support of 2,000 refugees to private organizations and drastically limit some of the legal avenues, which are already so limited, that are available to refugee claimants. Kenney has kind of misleadingly been declared, or is declaring that he is dealing with this backlog, right? This refugee backlog, which in fact we have to recognize that the Conservatives themselves created this backlog of refugees, of all these people who are waiting, and he's going to do them justice supposedly by getting rid of the backlog, was a creation of the Conservatives themselves, because they were refusing to appoint people to the Immigration and Refugee Board, and one of the few appointments that they did make was a very known anti-gay activist. And so what we're seeing is a dismantling of an already minimalist refugee protection system. And I abhor to even say that the current system protects refugees, but just to say that it's being eroded further. In addition, in 2009, Kenney imposed visa requirements on Mexico and the Czech Republic by suggesting that refugees from those countries were system abusers. And Kenney's gone out of his way to rely on these really insidious kind of words and language, right? Like bogus, system abusers, lying, cheats, kind of security threats, all these kinds of things. But again, to reiterate that while Kenney is really smart about manipulating these kinds of words and language, the fact that they resonate so much with people speaks more to our societal structures, right? In terms of the ways in which those existing prejudices against immigrants and the existing languages and ideas and ideologies that sustains this divide between so-called illegals and so-called citizens is what allows him to exploit those divisions. So simultaneously, as all these avenues for refugees and permanent residents are decreasing, temporary worker programs have proliferated under Jason Kenney. So for the first time now in Canadian history in the past few years, we have seen more people being admitted under temporary work programs than as permanent residents. And so what that means is, a model that is so ideal for corporations. So temporary workers are basically permanently temporary. People who are hyper-exploited, hyper-exploitable, endure long work hours, get paid less than minimum wage, have almost no labor protection, no health and safety protection, and most importantly are always under the threat of deportation, which is what makes them inherently exploited, right? So you can't really have labor protections when in fact what you're going to be faced with is deportation and the repercussion of repatriation when you raise any kind of claim against your employer. And in 2009, the federal government proposed further changes to the temporary worker program. And one regulation, which is kind of critical, is that it limits workers to a 4-year term, after which a 6-year ban will be imposed before workers can return. And in the meantime, while all these changes are happening within the temporary foreign worker program, we've seen that Jason Kenney has overseen a series of significantly large, massive immigration-style raids here in Ontario. Really US-style raids with massive enforcement teams. One of the ones that was the largest that I know of to date was in April of last year, where 100 non-status and migrant workers were rounded up with, guns to their head in workplaces. Many of them were picked up in their homes, and within 24 hours, approximately half of them were deported without even access to basic legal counsel, right? So we're seeing that the kind of discipline that's required, the collective discipline that's required within workers who are migrant workers, is these kinds of raids. So you go in, you have these kinds of raids to intimidate workers that ensures that the discipline that's required by the employer, which is to be silent, otherwise this is a repercussion, is ensured. I'm going to run through some of these things really quickly. So Jason Kenney's made a whole bunch of, along the lines of what I was saying earlier, he's made a whole bunch of incredibly oppressive, racist comments, which again, feeds into our existing societal prejudices. So he's declared that he will get tough on immigrants who don't speak the languages of English and French, which are, of course, colonial languages. He supports Quebec's Bill C-94, which people are probably familiar with, which is the bill that denies women who wear the niqab access to essential public services, including health and education. So Jason Kenney, this is a provincial bill that Jason Kenney has come out and expressed his support for. In 2009, he introduced a citizenship guide where it was leaked to the media that all references to LGBTQ communities was removed by Jason Kenney. So he removed all these references, and in the meantime, he flooded the citizenship guide with military recruitment advertisements and, basically glorifying war and occupation and the Canadian military. And his response when asked about why the references to the LGBTQ communities and rights was removed, he basically said, hey, the guide can't be 1,000 pages. And as people are probably familiar with, Jason Kenney's played a key role also in foreign policy. So, he cut ESL to the Canadian Arab Federation because of their involvement in pro-Palestinian efforts. He pulled Canada out of the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, claiming that it was anti-Semitic. He barred British MP George Galloway because of Galloway's vocal opposition to the military occupation of Afghanistan and Galloway's support for the democratically elected government of Hamas. He's also labeled Iraq war resistors as bogus refugee claimants. So you see that all the kinds of statements and policy changes that he's implementing are really far-reaching. So, what does this reflect, again, at a systemic level beyond just Jason Kenney? Because, again, he's this current manifestation, but these trends are much longer and will continue whether the Liberals are in power, the Conservatives, or the NDP.
Shame on him.
Shame on him, indeed.